Welcome to the show. My name is Bret, and this is my live stream every week for the last 2.5 years, I think, at least. We're on show, 155 now, so that's how many weeks we've been doing it. So, welcome. This is all about DevOps, containers, cloud native, Docker, Kubernetes, all those things. Every one of the, 1,000 projects there are in the cloud native ecosystem now. That's the topic of the day. So today is one of my monthly Udemy Q&As. So anything goes. You got questions about the courses, you got questions about other people's courses, you got questions that are related to the field of DevOps and modern container-based computing. I'm all ears. Let's see if we can find your answer. As you know, in the courses, you can jump into Slack or into Discord. That's right over there, the Discord server, devops.fan. We're over 8,000 people now talking about all things DevOps. People are sharing links. It's nice. People hang out there. It's great. I'm very happy that we've started to build a community there. And what I'd love to do is to see more people hanging out and figuring out if we can even do some stuff in Discord, like, show and tells, little presentations to that community, because it's grown large enough that if someone wants to share something, just reach out to me on Twitter or Discord and share your ideas, and we'll announce a time. Let's do something in Discord, do some learning. I mean, obviously we can all learn all day long on YouTube, which is pretty much where I live, that or Stack Overflow. But hey, let's do something in our Discord. If you're there and you want to share, let's do something. Let me know. All right, so announcements this week are usual announcements. If you have not signed up for my Patreon, you can do it totally free. You can buy me a coffee if you'd like, but that's not required. Scroll down, click the follow button, and you'll get my weekly announcements about new stuff I'm creating. For example, this week, blog post time. I think it was, maybe I mentioned it last week as well. So my third really long blog post as sort of a trilogy on the Udemy blog around Docker, Kubernetes, DevOps engineering, what is DevOps, and they all kind of go together. So if you're getting into DevOps or you're learning more about the details of DevOps beyond just learn a tool, that's what those blog posts are about. So go check that out. There's now 3 of them. I think they link to each other in some way so that you can follow along. There's really no particular order to them, but I made them to be actionable. I made them so they'd be useful and not just an explanation. So I worked really hard on all those. They're all at least a couple thousand words. The DevOps engineer one, I believe, or maybe it's the what is DevOps one of the two, actually has a 15-question analysis to help you determine what level of DevOpsness that you might be in your team. And I wanted to turn that into an online form so you could just kind of fill it out and then have your results, but I don't have that yet. But it is in the blog post. So just go check out the blog post. You can read all the questions. They're super easy. You get like 1, 3, or 5 is the answer, and basically you tally your score. And it covers a lot of the things that other things don't cover in terms of how do you know that you're down the path of DevOps. Are you just going through the motions and you've installed an automated CI solution? Because that's really just one tiny bit of the whole thing. And in a couple of those posts, I talk about possibly the future of DevOps and what maybe we're going to evolve to from the word DevOps. Yeah, so go check all that stuff out. And the other announcement, besides, hey, if you want to thank me, sign up as a patron. This show is supported by patrons. I don't have ads. There are no sponsors on this show other than you, fellow patrons. Thank you so much. And also, this comes out as a podcast. Every week we launch a podcast, usually on Fridays. You can go check them out. They're edited down versions of this show. And we've been releasing a bunch of past episodes that we never got to. And we're catching up from the 2021 year of live shows. The other thing as well, I already mentioned that. Discord server, right above me. I was forgetting my list. And that's it. That's all the announcements I really have. We are scheduling all of our shows for the early half of this year. So for like Q1 into Q2, I'm very excited. We're going to be looking at a lot of Kubernetes projects, Kubernetes-related projects. We're going to have some authors on the show that write books about all this stuff. So we're going to have some other experts on. And we're in the middle of all that scheduling stuff now. So thanks to Jenny, Beth, and the whole team that helps me make all that happen because it's a lot of work. All right. So hopefully you're here to learn and follow along, ask questions, hopefully, and learn from other people's questions because you all always have such great questions. So let's get into it. I don't really have any demos today, although certainly by request I can demo stuff. I've been organizing and working on a lot on my GitHub repos over the last couple of weeks, and basically in enabling superlinting, if you've heard me talk about that last year, superlinter, I've enabled that in almost every repo now. And GitHub Actions are everywhere. I have now dozens and dozens of them, and I've learned to use reusable workflows, which is a brand new feature, only like 3 months old with GitHub Actions, that allows you to run a workflow in another repo in your workflow right there in your own repo. So you don't have to repeat over and over the same workflow YAML. So if you have any questions about that stuff, of course, we talked a lot about GitHub Actions last year. So let me know. Hello, everyone. Najan Vogan. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing these names. Virosh. South Africa. Nice. Jeffrey's got questions. Which channel on Discord for questions? Well, there's tons of topic channels. So you can at me in any of those channels. I tend to prefer keeping the conversations in the Discord server, not in a DM, because then no one else gets to learn or help. And so just jump in the channel that you think is about that topic, and you can at me or anyone else there. There's usually someone in those channels to help out. Thanks so much, Tube. All right, back to Kevin. What do you think about Spinnaker? Any thoughts? We are considering this for some single cloud or hybrid cloud, but found it difficult. Does it work? Does it worth it hating Jenkins right now? If your code repos are on GitHub, GitHub Actions are now the one to beat. So I have never used Spinnaker in a production setting. I don't have any clients or students that I know of that use it. Not that it's a bad tool. Just don't see it being used a lot. So I'm sure there are people out there using it. I'm sure it's got a nice little ecosystem. But I think I've evolved to the point that I really want my automation platform to be deeply tied into where I do the rest of the work, which is managing code, doing the PRs, doing the issues. Why not have all the automation there? So GitHub Actions is either relatively cheap or free for most things. I think it's extremely valuable to most teams. And if your code's already on GitHub, you got to have a good argument nowadays for why you don't want to do everything else in GitHub. I am not a fan of Jira in most cases because with the new advanced features in GitHub Issues and in projects and the deep integration that can now have with GitHub Actions to automate all of that. So you can automate your issues, automate labels, automate responses, automate testing. You can just do all that right in the same interface. So I'm challenging all of my clients, and I guess I'm challenging you, that we don't need more tools. We probably need to reduce some of our tools and consolidate, because one of my rules with my teams are I never implement a new tool, ideally. I guess I wouldn't say never. I very rarely want to implement a new tool unless we're replacing another tool, because most of us have way too many tools. We can't manage them all as a team. There's too many. Everybody's got their own thing. So I'm always trying to consolidate and simplify the tooling. And I find in a lot of these cases, GitHub is good enough. Unless you're a 100-person software team that needs, there's huge projects with hundreds of people on GitHub. They're all managing their workflows through GitHub. So I'm sure a lot of you have opinions about that, and you're like, nope, it's not good enough. It doesn't have this. I need this. That's fine. That's fine for you, as long as you know your reasons. But I find a lot of people just opt out of that stuff and go looking for the hard tool. And I'm not a fan of running your own automation tools. I think we've kind of evolved beyond that. We've got Azure DevOps, we've got GitHub Actions, we've got all these SaaS services. Every cloud has their own automation platform. So I'm finding that a lot of these open source projects, and I'm calling it automation, by the way, not just CI, because a lot of these CI platforms are now doing deployment and other types of automation. So really, they're just an automated compute system with jobs and scheduling and that kind of thing. And I just find that running your own nowadays is a lot more work than necessary, and a lot of those tools are starting to languish. I used Drone for a long time, but Drone, the project, I feel like has kind of died on the vine. The ecosystem around it has really disappeared. A lot of the basic functionality I would expect out of the box isn't there. And that's what I'm seeing with a lot of other open source tools. I see tools where they're not redundant, so they go down. And there basically becomes a person who has to maintain it. Whereas with something like GitHub Actions, you don't have to deal with that. Anyway, that's my opinion, Kevin. But I don't have actually any production experience with Spinnaker. So hopefully you'll take that with a grain of salt, because I know everyone has strong opinions about their automation platform. But really, we're all busy. So I'm always trying to look for a way to manage less and do more faster. For sure, interested in the reusable GitHub Actions, says Cole. So real quick, since we're on that topic, I'm just going to pull it up. GitHub announced it. In November. So reusable workflows are generally available. This is for open repos, by the way. At least your GitHub Actions repo that you're calling, that one has to be open, because right now we don't have with internal or private repos the ability for one repo's action to then basically clone another private repo with the permissions to that repo. That doesn't really exist out of the box yet. So the repo that's storing all of these reusable workflows needs to be open source. I believe that the ones that call it to run it in their repo, those can be closed source if you'd like. But they give you a pretty good example, and I will put this all in the chat. And basically for me, what that has evolved to is I have my favorite super linter workflow. I guess I haven't been there in this browser. And you can find my videos about it. And then, yeah. So this is the actual workflow. So I dedicate an entire repo just to this workflow. And so I have a very custom setup designed for DevOps so that you can reuse it. And I do lots of things in there, like I set the permissions manually because I always want to be secure by default. I always want least privilege. So I do a bunch of stuff in here. So check out this workflow. I'll put this in the Slack. Put this in the YouTube chat. And then I have one called let's see, what's it called? I've already forgotten what it's called. GitHub Actions Templates. So in this GitHub Action Templates folder is the calling workflow. So you have your regular full workflow, and the gist here is you need a workflow call. So you need to give it the action workflow call, and then any optional inputs you want the calling workflow to provide, like which in this case it's linting, so only lint DevOps files rather than code files, only lint certain directories, so I'll let you filter that out. And then that's in the actual real beefy workflow. And the idea here is that I have this one workflow in one repo, and all my other ones reuse this same workflow. So this workflow is reusable, it's generic, and everything that needs to be customized is passed in as a input. And then in your calling repo, I have a very simple linter. It's just one line, really. Line 14. I call that workflow, and then I give it the options I need to disable or enable, or whatever that particular workflow needs. All right? So I'll give you that other repo as well, so you can check that one out. So that's reusable. Now, the cool thing is you can also do that in the same repo. So if you need to build 10 images in a repo because you have a mono repo, I do that in my own. You might have one that's pretty generic, one generic build workflow for Docker, which I also give as an example in this GitHub Actions templates. And it builds via my best practice setup all the things in GitHub Actions for Docker builds, including multi-platform builds, build it for ARM, build it for x86, build it for x64, whatever. Like all that's in there, proper tagging and proper labels. It's all there. And we've gone through that last year in this show. I'm not going to rehash it. So go back in this channel in the history on YouTube and just search for GitHub Actions and you'll find a bunch of that stuff. But you can make that generic workflow even in a private repo and then reuse it in that same private repo from other ones that just give it different input. So imagine yourself basically templating out your own Docker build workflow and then reusing that over and over in the same repo for other image types. A lot of people, especially in microservices, have mono repos. I have one called Bret.run. And if you just go to Bret.run, you can see that I have a bunch of different utilities I make container images from. You can actually see all those packages down here. And, for example, it lists all my packages. So, GitHub now has its own container registry. I'm storing these there. I'm also storing them on Docker Hub. And each directory is its own app that they're not related. So underneath, I have a bunch of workflows. And right now, the way they're all set up is they call my superlinter there. But what I meant to click on was in here, this is calling a build and push workflow. So basically, I have my events on when to run this workflow. That's the when. And this is the how. And all I'm doing is calling another reusable action in a different repo, but it could be in the same repo. And then I give it the custom settings. For example, the tags that it needs to have, the context in the Docker file for multi-stage Docker files, the platforms I want it to build for, and then even I pass in the Docker Hub secret password for Docker Hub that this repo would use when pushing its own images to Docker Hub. And it passes all that stuff to that reusable workflow, and that reusable workflow runs on the code of this repo. And that's how it all works. And it's really great. I wish it supported private to private repo. That's the one last thing I really want. But in case you didn't know, GitHub has their own repository and project for all their features. So let's look up GitHub roadmap. And they have this repo. Yeah. And what I do is I search for the thing I care about. I'm going to put this in the chat, this link. So I recommend all of you, if you're all using GitHub and there's something that you wish they had, or there's something that you care about, go here and search for it. So for example, I'm all about GitHub Actions last year. So I went through and I just searched for actions. And I found 22 things on the roadmap, and they actually have quarters that are scheduled for those things. What I do, reusable workflows, this has actually been finished. So you can see the little purple that indicates that it's finished. And we're now on quarter 1, 2022. So I don't care about that because that's a different type of GitHub, essentially GHES, which I don't use. Actions, support Mac OS 12 on GitHub hosted runners. I might care about that. So I go into the issue, I scroll down, and I click subscribe. So that will keep me up to date. I'll get alerts, essentially, when movement happens on this GitHub issue. And you'll see them scheduling when they're going to work on it. You'll see that when it's released, they'll put comments sometimes in here. And so that's how I get to know the latest and greatest. The other thing you can do is on Twitter. Let's see. I'm not sure if this is it. That's not it. I'm basically looking for change log. There we go. So the GitHub change log is also another really great way to stay up to date on all the things changing in GitHub. Even if you don't have a lot of your code in GitHub, you're using GitHub all day long anyway, because that's where all the open source is at, or most of it. So go to the GitHub Change Log and follow that Twitter account. What I actually end up doing is I actually set it to alert me, so that I basically get a pop-up, and the tweet is the new thing that they just launched. And they do this daily. Like this is standard modern day deployment type stuff where they're releasing all day, every day. The various teams in GitHub are releasing all the time. So they put all this stuff here, and I'll just see the title of my tweet, on my notifications, and I'll just swipe it if I don't care about it, right? But if I want to know more, I can click it and go read the announcement article or whatever. And that's how I stay up to date on that, because it can be a little bit hard to figure out what is different, what has GitHub changed in the last 6 months, right? That's kind of hard. So I do that. Pro tips. Hopefully that helps. Let's go back to questions. Thanks again, too. I really appreciate that. I always enjoy hearing from students that are finding it valuable. Hello, Vienna. Nice. What's up, Jude? Paul, show 155 with a few rare weeks off. I'll make that more than 2.5 for you. Yeah, a little bit more. 3.5 maybe, because we did take some weeks off for holidays and stuff. So maybe it's 3.5. Have you yet talked about Start containers on demand? I'm not sure. Why don't you give me a longer description of your question? Like, what exactly are we talking about? We're talking about Docker, Kubernetes. What do you mean by starting containers on demand? Are you talking about auto scaling? Give me more details too, but I'm happy to comment. Does Azure DevOps contain reusable actions? I don't actually know. I am not a big user of Azure DevOps. I work with teams that use it, and I watch them use it, but I don't spend a lot of time with it myself. I'm not terribly fond of cloud, although it has its uses, cloud-specific automation, like for a particular cloud provider. And I feel like we've got so many other options that aren't cloud-specific and are a little bit more generalized, so that I can use them across clouds, multi-cloud, hybrid cloud, data center, and the cloud, right? That kind of stuff. So I don't tend to spend a lot of time on Azure or AWS's own automation platforms. Not that they're not cool, but as a consultant and as a teacher, I can't really just pick one thing. So that's kind of my limitation, is that I have clients on Azure, I have clients on AWS, I have clients on DigitalOcean, How do I use an entire disk partition for a container volume? I've heard of driver ops, but don't know how to use it. I've been using bind mounts, but I don't think it's the best option. I might have a pro tip for you there. Let me see if I can't find you. So a presentation by Brandon Mitchell, another Docker captain, and I'm going to bring that up here, actually shows it's not really a hack. It's just not a well-known feature that you can specify the location of a volume, and so that you can keep it underneath the management of volumes, but then you can essentially point it to the root of a mount that you have for an external drive, maybe, or another disk. Is that if that's what you're talking about? So I'm going to put this link in chat, so you can check this presentation out. But if you go to the local volume driver, it shows some options around how to use NFS, how to use different types of volumes. Like this example actually mounts an NFS. So it creates a volume, but the volume isn't local, right? It's on an NFS server remotely. This one shows about, well, this is another way to do it. Actually, this is like how to mount that inside a single Docker container. Let's see what else we got. Other file systems. This is showing how you can, again, make that volume on a different device. And in this case, they're making it read-only, which maybe you don't want to do, but it's it's not using the default location. And Docker volumes, if you've seen using the local driver, that's what every volume has a driver, and this one is just local driver. That's the default in Docker. And so this is showing how to use that in a compose file. So it's pretty great. This even shows how to use a overlay file system as a volume, which I've never needed to use. I've never had anyone need, but this is kind of the tips and tricks, hacks things that sudo bmich puts out, and I love it. He might even have a newer version of this. He probably keeps this in a GitHub repo. I mean, this is a GitHub repo. So this is DC 2019. There might be something else there. Anyway, check that out. That might help you. Speaking of complexity, is there a better Kubernetes deployment tool than Helm? It is somewhat obscure. Yeah, so Helm is more complicated than Kustomize, and Kustomize is more complicated than standard manifest, right? So when I'm teaching people, I typically will force them to handwrite the manifest, because what I want them to understand is that all of this at the end of the day ends up in a manifest file, right? It may be YAML, it may be JSON, but all these other tools will basically convert these resources into JSON before they're talking to the Kubernetes API. So I've seen people use handlebars, just straight up handlebars or mustache as a templating engine for YAML. And when it's done spitting it out, it's just straight up manifest files, because that's really all Helm's doing. The nice thing about Helm and Kustomize is, one, Kustomize is built in the command line, and it is a little simpler than learning all the templating syntax of Helm. However, Helm has a bunch of additional command lines and hooks. Two of my favorite things with Helm is that I can see what charts I've deployed, I can see versions, I can pull down repos and have chart versions, and I like that in a lot of ways. I don't always use it that way, but I like those things. And then Helm hooks for more advanced projects, which most of us will eventually be on, especially for legacy code where you need to do data migrations, database upgrade kind of things, or you need other jobs to run before install, like maybe a setup script that seeds your database. All these types of things, there's multiple ways to handle it, and Biker and I talked about it yesterday and the High Fiver Hangout that we had. By the way, sign up for that on Patreon. If you sign up in Patreon for the High Fivers Club, you get to join us on a monthly hangout call. But we talked yesterday a little bit about the different ways to control the order of things when you're rolling out changes in Kubernetes. He brought up that there are built-in hooks inside of straight up manifests in Kubernetes. Helm, I think, is richer. It has more. It has like 8 or 10 of them. So you can do post-install, pre-install, post-upgrade, pre-upgrade, post-rollback, pre-delete, post-delete. Like you have all these different things, right, in there for Helm. And I tend to find that people like that. Plus, the nice thing about Helm is you can add dependency charts, you can add subcharts. So I think eventually most people graduate to Helm because their workflows require that level of complexity. But there's no reason why you can't try it out, Kustomize. Now, for those of you listening, of course, all these questions, we're looking for your answers, right? So if you have better answers or different answers, please speak up in the chat. And there are no less than 50 to 80 different methodologies for how to deploy to Kubernetes. You could even use compose files. If you build the Docker command line with a custom flag, it will build in Kubernetes deployment conversion essentially inside the Docker command line. So you can do a Docker compose up, and it will take your compose file and turn it into Kubernetes manifests. And you can find more about that kind of hidden away inside of the compose repo. So github.com/docker/compose. And it's not obvious how to do that there, but there is a custom, you might have to go look in issues or in PRs for Kubernetes support, but it is there. It just requires that you rebuild the tool. I don't know anyone in real production setups yet that are using it that way, using Compose to automatically deploy to Kubernetes. But who knows? Maybe that's the future of simpler setups and designs. But those of you listening, if you're not using Helm or Kustomize or just straight up manifests for describing your resources in Kubernetes, let us know. Let us know in chat. Yeah, supporting your own tool is counterproductive. It's counterproductive unless you're a team that's already doing a lot of templating and for other tooling. That's why I see web dev teams that often are using handlebars and their own repos for their front end code or whatever, that that speaks to them for creating Kubernetes manifest because it's the same tool they're used to and it's already got a CLI to it or whatever they're doing. So I have seen that. I don't see it a lot, but I do see that in fairly sophisticated teams where they're just not wanting to learn yet another tool. They end up doing that. But yeah, Biker and I have had this conversation going on for a while now. Can actions be used to generate Kubernetes YAML or just control the workflow? Actions can really be used for just about anything. I mean, there are a lot of actions that will write and commit back to your repo. So robots can make commits, right? So you could potentially, for example, if you decide to store in your repo the generated content, whether that's minified CSS or JavaScript, or that's YAML into JSON, or that's templated YAML into non-templated YAML, you can technically do that with a bot where you write in one directory and then there's some sort of output directory that you sort of create a rule for the humans to know that they should never touch that directory, that's for the robots to create. You could do that, right? You can also have GitHub Actions creating artifacts, which could be downloadable objects, kind of like an S3 object. You can have it generate those and upload those in the action for download later or for reuse in later workflows. So you can maybe generate those manifests, store them as an asset in the run of the GitHub action, and they're called artifacts, and then have some other thing go and pull those and use them later. It's kind of how you could pass files back and forth between workflows. At the moment, private to private actions would be ideal for my situation, but this is very helpful. Well, thank you. Yeah, the private to private for a lot of companies is really going to be one of the key reusable things. The other thing you can do besides just reuse is you at least make templates. So what I do is for organizations, I'll make a GitHub Actions template repo that basically becomes the template repo for any new repos. And it will seed them with the superlinter, possibly with a Docker build, possibly with a CVE scanner for the images, and then a whole bunch of linter defaults. Maybe we'll do a markdown linter override or a shell check linter override or something like that. And I will create all that in the repo and mark it as a template repo, which you do from the settings of any repo. And then when anyone else in your org goes to create a new repo in the GitHub UI, they will see an option for, hey, would you like to use a template? This organization has these templates, and it will just copy all those files when it clones it in. So you can do that as well. That is not as near as good as reusable templates, but it's a start. Maz asks, is there a best practice for how to use branches to release building Docker images to different environments in GitHub Actions? So in case people don't know, there are a few features in GitHub that aren't immediately obvious. One of them is environments, which is basically them slowly taking some of the functionality out of Azure's DevOps tooling and starting to implement it into GitHub Actions or just GitHub itself. And one of those things is environments. And so what you can do is I would not create branches for environments. I do not think that pattern works well at scale, because then you end up doing a lot of merging and things start to really deviate over time. And one of the problems is you can't work on two at the same time, right? You have to swap branches in order to work on one, then swap a branch and stash in order to work on another one, and that's just too much of a headache. So I would not recommend branches for environments. What I recommend is that you create a directory structure in your main branch for environments, and then you use GitHub's environments feature to set the secrets that will apply to each one of those environments. So you can set up inside of GitHub, for example, if I just went to my template repo, there's technically this environment. It's not listed here yet, but if I went into my settings of this repo, under environments, I can start adding new environments here and then create secrets for that environment. And then because all of my files for that environment will be in a specific set of workflows or in a specific set of folders, I can now have my workflows scoped with paths for that. That's also how I build a bunch of different things all at the same time in a single mono repo. So in a mono repo design, each one of these folders is a different app, and I have workflows for each one of those locations, and I scope them to only the files that I want the workflow to run for. So for each one of these apps, I essentially say, if there's no changes in the clock directory or to the clock workflow, then don't run this workflow. And that's how I can scope my changes. And imagine if these were all environments, and I might create a generic workflow that I reuse over and over in this same repo for each environment. So at the end of the day, I might have a generic workflow that does the same thing, but it's templated, and then another workflow for each one of my environments that targets a specific set of directories and uses a set of environment secrets from my settings to deploy to that app, to deploy to that environment. So that's kind of how that works. There's also a deployment feature in GitHub. If you look up in the GitHub help, you can just look on their website for deployments. That is another potential useful feature that's usually used for third-party tools that help you deploy your code right out of GitHub using webhooks. But you can also now use it in some ways with GitHub Actions. I would research that because I'm not an expert on that feature yet because I haven't actually used it inside of GitHub Actions. But we're starting to see these features show up that allow us to manage many environments from code in a single repo in a single branch, which is, I think, kind of how we're all going to be doing it. Now, what we want to add, by the way, with that is you want to start using branch protection so that you basically enforce that. In here, you can add a rule that says I need all of my checks to pass and all of my PRs to have to basically be required, and that I'm not allowed to commit directly to my main branch. This will start to enforce that PR workflow that guarantees that all of your workflows run correctly in the PR before you make changes to production clusters. So you can even go and look inside the GitHub documentation, and they talk about how to set up workflows for deploying production work code or deploying production code using all these built-in features. So you might want to read up on that. There's some pretty good examples in the documentation. That's a great question, though, Moz. Thank you. Jeffrey moved his question over to Discord. Sounds good. What is your thought on the DevOps 4 key metrics? Philip, I talk about that in my Udemy blog post. You can scroll up to the top and actually click on one of those, and it'll work you through the other ones. I talk about like mean time to recovery, those kinds of metrics, and they're very important. And I talk about them in those blog posts. So I think that blog post specifically is Udemy. Let's see, DevOps. See if I can hit it on the first try. Yep. What is DevOps? So you'll see me talk about that, like MTTD and MTTR and what vanity metrics are. All of that is in this blog post over on Udemy. So go check that out. I'm assuming you already know about them since you know that there's a classic definition of 4. I would say that there's probably a lot more than 4 that we really need to care about, but we start with those, right? We start with those basic metrics. And that's often what I want my teams to implement. When I'm working with a team on adopting DevOps practices, I will also ask them for what metrics they're following to measure their success. Because simply closing a ticket and solving work and doing work isn't necessarily furthering you down the DevOps maturity, scale. So this post talks all about that and what you might want to care about, what you may not want to care about, advantages, all that stuff. So hopefully that helps. Let's see what other questions we got. Tube is asking, giving more details on the previous question. I would like to do ethic DevOps and consume less energy. That's why I would like my client to go on a web page and ask to launch his back office containers. That's what I hope about automatic launching of containers on demand. Well, there's lots to talk about there. So containers on demand generally means some sort of automation is automatically kicking them off, like auto-scaling your nodes or auto-scaling your replicas. And so, for example, Kubernetes has an auto-scaling built in when you enable metrics, and you can basically get pod auto-scaling out of the box. That's one way to be more efficient, is to say give me the necessary pods minimum, and if I need more resources because a lot of stuff is happening, you monitor resources and then scale up my number of pods. There's also node scaling, which we've had for years and years in AWS with something called auto scaling for your EC2 instances. And of course, if you use serverless functions, Lambdas, all those types of things, that's inherent. Like those things are designed to be scale to zero and scale up as needed. But when you're talking about a human manually requesting a service to be available and then for that to be spun up, that sounds like one of two things. That sounds like maybe something you would do in automation. This is very common back in the Jenkins days. If someone needed to spin up a dev environment, for example, they would go and start a pipeline workflow inside of Jenkins. You can do that inside of GitHub Actions with something called the workflow dispatch. And the workflow dispatch allows you to create form fields that someone could fill out in the repo and then submit it, and it would run a particular workflow with those fields, whatever they need to fill in, the secret they need to pass, the name of the environment to create, the location that it needs to be created. So you can do that and have GitHub Actions control whatever APIs you're talking about. But again, this largely depends on what CI automation tool you're using, where are you running your containers, how are you running your containers, is it Docker, is it Kubernetes, is it the cloud, is it on-prem? All those things matter. But in general, yeah, I would say a CI automation tool is probably that. If you went really custom, you might look at something like Backstage from Spotify. So Backstage IO, this is more involved and more custom, but if you're looking for a really custom solution, it's essentially a portal toolkit that it's helping you design a web interface. Again, this is coding, right? This is something you're going to be doing in a language, but it's a series of libraries and tools to allow you to quickly create a web UI that others can use to create things. So imagine if you wanted to enable your developers or your team to spin up Kubernetes instances on the fly or to deploy multiple copies of a particular app, stuff like that. You can create custom interfaces that do that for your users without them having to do it in code, right? Or to know command line tools or to know DevOps command line tools. So I will throw Backstage in here. You definitely need to be a developer to use it, to set it up at least, but your customer doesn't need to be that, right? So I would check that out. If anyone's used Backstage, by the way, please put your opinions in Slack or in chat. I keep saying Slack today. Put that in chat because I haven't used Backstage myself. I just work with people that do. So I know that's a thing. Glad I answered Vaughn's question. Dan is saying January 31st. Yep, the deadline's coming. We should probably have another show to talk about it next week. Thanks for reminding me, Dan. Paid subscription for Docker Desktop. What about Docker CE for RHEL 7.8? Is it still free? So Dan, Docker Desktop is the human tool for using on your desktop, right? They don't yet have a Linux version of that, but they are working on it. I heard rumors of a beta. So we have it for Mac and Windows, and that's largely because Mac and Windows can't just natively run Docker, right? But on Linux, you can natively run the Docker daemon and Docker CLI. Those are all completely open source. So this announcement about Docker Desktop does not affect any of Docker's open source. Docker never changed the license of their open source for any of this. This was solely about their closed source paid offerings and their SaaS offerings. So if you're using Docker Desktop for commercial purposes and you're a certain size of company, you need to start paying for it by the end of the month to be legal. But they're not going to enforce that. So if you're a student or you're using it only for learning, or using it only for personal use and not for your company's use, then you can still use Docker Desktop anywhere. But if you're not using Docker Desktop, if you're using any of the other Docker tools, Docker Command Line, Docker Engine, Docker Compose, Build Kit, those tools have been and always will be open source, according to Docker. They don't plan to change any licensing on any of that stuff. The licensing change was really just about their closed source Docker Desktop tool, which, yes, it has open source components in it, like Docker Engine and Docker Command Line and Compose. But the minute you install Docker Desktop, you're bound by the license for paying for it. If you just install apt and yum packages, those are always free, right? Those are open source. Hopefully that helps, Dan. So the answer is yes. Is it still free? Yes. You may use Compose to convert Compose files to Helm charts. Yes. Compose with a K does that as well. Thanks for mentioning that. I'm glad you brought that up. Will the depends option work for Compose in Kubernetes? I don't know. So you have to go look at the spec and see if you have to look at the code essentially to do that. It depends on, by the way, works for everything now because there is no more versions of Compose files. So when you go in your Compose file, just remove the version and every feature now works. Depends on works in Docker Compose everywhere, regardless of version. When you're talking about Compose. In Kubernetes, depends on, so think about it this way. Docker Compose up for Kubernetes does not have some sort of custom controller in Kubernetes. So it's only going to be able to do what Kubernetes resources can do out of the box. And so if they don't support a depends on like architecture, and other than lifecycle hooks, they don't, then it's not going to work, right? Because Compose isn't doing anything special here. Compose isn't controlling, as far as I know, it's not controlling the order of things when it's deploying stuff to Kubernetes. Now, that could all change. They could add that functionality and it be Helm-like with Helm hooks, so to speak. But I don't know that that's a thing yet. Don't quote me 100% on that. I would need to go check the source code in the Compose repo to see exactly what Kubernetes is really doing when Compose is talking to it, right? So essentially what's happening is the Docker Compose engine or command line right there is talking to your Kubernetes API. So it could, it's one of those things where you could go to the Docker roadmap, right? GitHub.com roadmap. And if we look up the projects, they have their project here for all feature requests. And you could add a feature request. So let's see what we got. Kubernetes. Nothing. Nothing in any of there. So someone might, maybe there is an issue for Kubernetes that's just not made it to the board yet, because that sometimes happens. So yeah, so there's a bunch. Yeah, Kubernetes backend for Docker Compose. So there you go. There's a feature right there. That's where people are talking about it. And you probably should go thumbs up it. So let's see if we can get the power of the chat. If everyone wants to go and thumbs up that issue, it helps set the priorities for Docker's internal development. They use this roadmap to guide their decisions about what features the developers really want in the tool. So if you want that, go try it out. Eon saying, I'm learning your Docker course on Udemy this week. Nice. Right. Good job. What's your opinion about Ansible? Says Ruslan or Ruslan. Ruslan? Hopefully I pronounced one of those correctly. What's your opinion about Ansible? Good, bad tool, worth implementing in a big company, 4,000 plus people, anything better than Ansible? So I don't think Ansible is still absolutely relevant. If you need to manage details about something inside of servers, like deploying different apt packages inside a server, controlling settings inside servers, that kind of thing, then I think Ansible still has a role for you. If you're creating infrastructure and you're simply needing to deploy or create assets and manage assets and objects, especially when it comes to cloud APIs. I think Terraform is more that tool. What I do see is people using Terraform to create and manage the life cycle of infrastructure, and then only when necessary, using Ansible to control package managers and settings inside of Linux, maybe Windows, in those environments. So what I do see is I see other tools removing the need for so much Ansible, or possibly even removing the need for Ansible. For example, if you're just focused on cloud only, you might be able to get away with not needing to manage real servers, like instances, right? If you're using something like Fargate on AWS, then you don't need to manage the instances. They're taken away from you. They're abstracted from you. And this is really the future of DevOps. The future of DevOps is less managing OSs and more about managing resources. And in the case of a lot of the clouds now, they can either do partial or complete management of those Linux nodes for you so that you don't ever need to shell in. In fact, we had on the show a couple weeks ago, we had a company on to talk about ways to deploy your containers on infrastructure without Kubernetes and without even having a shell. Like, you can't actually get SSH into the server because it doesn't exist. And we're seeing more tools like that. Let me actually just look that up. I'm going to give you the link to that. So Cycle, for example, is a relatively new tool. Cycle is a relatively new tool that allows you to deploy containers without all the complexity. So you would never need Ansible to run containers or to run orchestration and have all the networking and the DNS and the load balancers and the proxies and all that. So the future is really trying to make the OS an irrelevant abstraction. Just like the cloud made the hardware resources something that we didn't have to concern ourselves with. We don't have to care about the power or the networking hardware and all that stuff. It's managed for us. We create things on the fly. And the next thing that's happening is the removal of the OS itself, right? Functions as a service or serverless was the start of that. That was one of the first experiments. A lot of these other services also run containers, as like Google Cloud Run just runs a simple container without you seeing the underlying infrastructure. So a lot of these things are removing the need for us to ever need something like Ansible. So I think that Ansible still has a place, but its use over time will get less and less and less, in my opinion. All right. Great question. Would it be better to use AWS Kubernetes than AWS Elastic Container Service for rapid deployment? I think that ECS is only there for people that don't care about multi-cloud or hybrid cloud, and they want a relatively a less complex solution. But honestly, I feel like at this point, there's so many Kubernetes resources for learning the basics of Kubernetes, and you don't need 1,000 types of resources in Kubernetes to get the job done, right? I think ECS, what I see is I don't see people deploying brand new infrastructure on ECS. So if you don't have ECS today, skip it. Go for Kubernetes, because everyone in the industry is learning Kubernetes, learning Docker, obviously, but learning Kubernetes on top of that. Kubernetes is on every platform now, and there's multiple offerings now from AWS on Kubernetes and from Azure and all these other places. There's just tons of Kubernetes. So and Kubernetes itself, you don't need to manage it as much because they manage it for you. So they've reduced the complexity of deployment and management, and there's tons of learning resources like my own resources for learning Kubernetes. So I would always recommend Kubernetes over ECS, because if you're going to go ahead with an orchestrator that's managed in a cloud, why go with one that's unique to only one cloud, and anything you learn there may not be transferable to anywhere else in your life, in anywhere other cloud or any other environment. ECS was created before Kubernetes was popular, right? Because Amazon was bullish on ECS. Even before Swarm mode came out, ECS was out, right? So it's, I think, just really around for those that don't want to go the Kubernetes path, but I don't really agree with that strategy, because it's probably going to be at some point harder to find people that know ECS than it is to people that know Kubernetes. That's a big deal. You don't want to use some architecture or technology that new hires won't know. So why not use the thing that we're all coalescing around and synergizing on, right? Great question, though. Thank you for asking that. Team City, Nurjan. Hopefully that's close to the name pronunciation. What is your opinion about Team City? I don't use Team City, so I don't really have a strong opinion. I don't see it in my circles used or in with any of my customers. So I'm sure it has a strong ecosystem, but I rarely see it, and I don't choose it for anything. Again, I default to everything GitHub because that's where all this stuff is happening. So why not stick with that one tool and keep it simpler? So might work for you though. It's up to you. Varish. So if you have a question, just ask it. Don't ask to ask. Ask the question. ECS is a wrapper for Swarm. Maybe. I wouldn't really say that. I mean, it's not running Swarm underneath, but it can consume a compose file. And it's, as far as I know, still at least using the Docker engine, which is nice. When should you and when should you not use multi-cluster? So when you say multi-cluster, what I assume is you're referring to is multi-cluster for cluster-based load balancing. So in case one cluster goes down, another one can pick up the pace. I would say that's a fairly mature requirement. My experience is every company that deploys Kubernetes ends up with multi-cluster, meaning they have many Kubernetes clusters. They have a test, they have a prod, they have a staging, they have a bunch of dev clusters. So everyone's going to end up with many clusters. But in your case, you might be referring to multi-cluster as in we have two clusters for redundancy. Or possibly you might mean we have two clusters for not putting all our eggs in one basket. And that's fine too. I would try to keep anything with a particular app, any of the things that an app needs for it to communicate with. If you're going to run that in containers, that should ideally all be in the same cluster. If you need a second cluster for redundancy, then it's going to just mirror that cluster. And you can use projects out there. I believe Contour has a project. And there's possibly the Kubernetes Gateway project, Gateway API, that will allow you easier ways to essentially have two clusters with mirrored resources and then a front cluster that acts as the load balancer for those two. I've seen that kind of setup, but honestly, those are all really advanced things. So I wouldn't recommend that to people unless they were well into their first year, if not more than first year of using Kubernetes in production. And because Kubernetes clusters by design, if you deploy them properly, they already have all the fault tolerance built in, right? They have multiple etcd databases. They have at least 3 replicas of that, possibly 5. They have at least multi-replicas of all the Kubernetes core services so that it won't fail if any one node goes down or any one zone goes down and as an availability zone, right? So that all happens inside a single cluster. So you're already highly fault tolerant. And inside there, you can make multiple replicas of your app to be highly fault tolerant. So when you go to multi-cluster for fault tolerant purposes, you're already, I would say the 1%er of all Kubernetes users, that you're getting quite complex, and your complexity is going to grow significantly because now you need to make sure that both clusters are receiving traffic, because I don't agree with the idea of standby clusters, because then you never really know if that cluster is working or not. So if you're going to have a solution, we actually talked about this with Cycle the other week when Cycle was on the show. We talked about the idea that everything should be active-active, right? Whenever you have something that's passive or standby, you never really know if it's going to be able to handle the load or if it's going to work exactly the same way. So keep everything active, which means there's a load balancer pointing to both clusters and sending traffic to both, which makes it really complicated to keep the databases in sync if you're storing databases, or if you're using database-based session cookies and stuff like that, then it just starts to get challenging over time. So I don't recommend it unless you have a really strong need and you know why you need it. Because again, Kubernetes is fault tolerant out of the box if you have a fault tolerant design of your cluster. All right. How Docker is useful in the blockchain and machine learning. Well, any application that you want to run over and over and control the versions and deploy updates easily and faster than normal, I would say Docker is useful. So it can be, it doesn't matter what the app is, whether it's running blockchain or an API or a Python script to do machine learning, like that's all built in as advantages of deploying apps in containers. So I would say that everything on servers, all server workloads are moving, if not already, are moving towards a container design. Now, what the tool is they use to run those containers might be different, but the container image as the deployment object, that's becoming the standard. I'm not an expert on machine learning or blockchain, so there might be specific tools that help you run containers or workloads in those ecosystems, but I bet you that there is an effort going on there to move to container images and containers themselves as the runtime object. So it still behooves you to learn Docker for that. The question just is, once you want to run your code in those ecosystem toolings, what tool is the preferred way to run containers there? Let's see. Lee's back with another question. Does Kube integrate okay in AWS with other resources? Does Kube integrate okay with AWS? Yes. Perms executing Lambda functions. Absolutely. No. Kubernetes, AWS does Kubernetes in a way that, security groups, RBAC, all those things work natively with the rest of the AWS tooling. So yes, it is designed to work well inside of that walled garden, right? So you get, for example, automatic support of their load balancers or their custom storage. All those things come with their Kubernetes design out of the box. Good question. All right, so we've got a few more questions to catch up with. So, and then we're going to wrap it up. So make sure you get your questions in because I'm like ringing that bell for, maybe the sad trombone for the fact that we're coming to an end. But let's get some of these last questions done. For new small projects, couple services and apps, what would you suggest? Currently using Docker Swarm, considering Nomad, K8's overhead and complexity seems overkill for solo DevOps or small teams. At this point, honestly, I'm bullish on Kubernetes because that's where all the action is happening. So if you choose another tool like Nomad or Swarm, you have to realize that there will be less tooling support, less experience with the people that you hire. They probably won't have experience with those tools. So they're going to have to learn them. And they're going to probably come, if anything, with Kubernetes experience. So I'm not, we have all these minimal distributions. We have cloud-controlled Kubernetes that removes a lot, if not all, of the complexity of managing the nodes and managing the infrastructure. And then you have tools like Argo CD and Flux that help automate all your deployments. So all you have to do is create the YAML for your resources, and then these other tools automate the updates, automate testing and health checking. And so what we're seeing is all these tools being added to the Kubernetes ecosystem to help solve that problem. It doesn't mean you have to develop in Kubernetes. Just because your clusters on the internet are using Kubernetes to deploy in production doesn't mean you need Kubernetes locally for development. So I don't think any of my customers that have used Kubernetes ever use it in local development. What they will do is for testing purposes, just so that they can make sure things work right when they're doing their Kubernetes YAML changes, they'll have some sort of Rancher desktop or Docker desktop Kubernetes, or Keys, which is essentially Rancher desktop now, or MicroK8s or Minikube. They'll use one of those things, or Kind, Kind, that are all very minimal, small setups for Kubernetes when they need to do testing. But they won't run it all the time, right? That's for Docker and Compose, right? Docker Desktop and the Compose workflow is still the best way for developing local. But I honestly would urge you to strongly consider Kubernetes, because once you've got that YAML set up, there's not a whole lot of extra complexity in supporting that YAML. I agree, like the act of creating that YAML up front is a significant effort. But if you're going to go Nomad, you're going to have to do the same thing in Nomad. And with Nomad, you're going to have to build your own servers and build your own clusters and manage them yourselves, whereas with Kubernetes, the cloud does it for you. So Nomad might actually be more work, even though it seems simpler. You also have to manage your own console cluster and keep that up and running when you're doing Nomad. Now, one of my goals for this year actually is to have one of the Nomad team members on the show, because I'm sure that there are use cases for Nomad, and it's not necessarily a bad tool. But a lot of the questions when I work with people and the people that ask advice is, none of us have free time. We're all super busy, and we need less tooling management. We need less things to manage. So I'm always advocating for things like Fargate or, Google's auto-managed Kubernetes clusters, right? What I always forget what the name of it is. But the idea where I don't have to manage the nodes, I don't have to patch the nodes, I'm just running containers on the cloud. If I can get away with that and not have to have servers to manage, it's a win for my team, because now we have less things we need to do. I will even have a team change the architecture of our applications or the way we're running them so that we can fit into these easier tools like Google Cloud Run or Fargate, something like that, right? We will design our apps differently over time. Obviously, there's work involved, but we'll do that in order to save ourselves all the headache of managing a bunch of Linux servers and patching them and securing SSH and, replacing them when they get to be an old version of the OS. Like, those are all things that unless you need to do them nowadays and you know why you have to do them, you shouldn't need to do them. We have so many other things that we can spend our time on. So that's what I would suggest. What is my preferred method for tagging Docker images for backend API applications? Not sure what you mean. Like, a tag, if you're referring to like how do you version things and keep things differentiated so that you're not reusing the same tags, then you do it how you want. You can do Symver. You can do Symver plus a date. You can do date-based only. You can do manual promotion, where you actually have to manually re-tag an image and re-upload it in order to make it approved for production. You can do all those things. I've seen teams do all those things. I tend to default to, for small things, I still make a latest, but the latest is for user convenience of developers and operators, right? It's just for us to use on our local machine, because latest is reused, and I never want to use that on a server. I always want to guarantee the exact tag is only used once. So I will often use a combination like the Symver plus a date, or the commit hash, or the Symver plus a commit hash, or the Symver plus something else. I usually don't use just Symver, because one of the challenges is, what if you need to change something about the image but not the code itself? Do you version the code because you changed the Kubernetes manifest YAML? Something like that. So often I'll find that people need something like a version of the app and then a version or a date of the infrastructure that deploys that app. Usually, with Helm charts, there's a chart version. So you'd have app version, Helm chart version as the tag, so that you could identify exactly what's in the image and exactly which chart is deploying that image, right? So anyway, you might do that. There's all sorts of different combinations, but I don't see any one always used, right? It really has to do with the team's workflow, whether they support multiple production environments. Are they running a SaaS, or are they shipping their software to on-prem, right? All of these factors and the way that their application releases happen. Are you a GitHub flow type of team where you always release from the main branch and every commit in main or master is deployable? Or are you a company that releases and supports many versions at once? Do you have a version 4 of your product and then a version 5? And then if you need to patch version 4, then you release a 4.2.1 while you're also shipping a version 5.2.3. Like, if you're doing that kind of release complexity, you're going to have to come up with something that's, Symver plus date-based, or Symver plus commit hash, or Symver plus infrastructure code version or something like that, right? It just depends. Jeffrey's saying working on a blockchain project and doing everything in Docker containers. So there you go. There you go. Jeremy's asking for a load balancer IP for control plane nodes in an on-prem Kubernetes cluster. Would you suggest something like kubevip or kubevip that runs inside the cluster, or keep alive D that would run outside the cluster, or what? So I see Metal used a lot. So Metal's project allows you to shift IPs back and forward on Kubernetes hardware, like on the actual node itself. Metal LB is actually the project name. So just look up Metal LB. I see that used a lot. It's kind of like the Kubernetes version of Keep Alive D. I don't see people using Keep Alive directly or manually, because ideally when you're using Kubernetes, you're not also dealing with manual things on the host, right? You don't want to be controlling things on the host once it's been deployed. You kind of want Kubernetes to manage that node lifecycle. So I don't know about kubevip. I've heard of it, but I've not used it. So I don't really have a way to compare it to Metal. I have used Metal. It's something that I can use in my home because it works simple out of the box in order to have multiple systems on my home network that potentially fail over if I want to do that and that works, between two different virtual machines. That's the kind of thing I can play with there. A lot of companies use an external load balancer like an L5, right? A layer 5 load balancer is a very enterprisey way to do it, where they will buy a rack mounted, customized, setup for multiple hardware redundant layer 5 proxies. And that will be in front of the Kubernetes clusters, and those clusters will control the L5 remotely through the L5 API. So I see that as well. So cloud managed Kubernetes is not an option. So if cloud managed Kubernetes is not an option, then I would look at something like MicroK8s. MicroK8s is automatically set up on Ubuntu or any snap-based Linux machine. It allows you one-line commands to add additional nodes. It provides high availability and fault tolerance out of the box, and it's all managed through a very easy CLI. So try out MicroK8s. Right, MicroK8s.io. So that one is a very popular one. Doesn't require a lot. It requires a lot less work than something like kubeadmin. So you could use Ansible for that, to reinstall everything on your machine. I don't use Ansible. I actually just use a shell script that basically installs a bunch of brew packages on my Mac, but similar idea. That when you get a new machine, you really want easy setup of things. And we're kind of spoiled in Mac because of brew ecosystem. And all right. So thank you all so much for the questions. We're about to hit an hour and a half, and I'm losing my voice. So we're going to wrap this up. I will be back next week. I don't have an announcement about exactly what's going to be on the show next week. So watch on the Patreon. Remember to go to patreon.com/Bret Fisher and sign up for the free emails there. Just say follow, and you'll know what we're going to do on the show next week. And I have a couple of ideas, but I'm going to have to spend some time setting up some example repos before we can do something. So come back and check it out. See you next time on YouTube Live. This time next week. Bye.